The Middle East Institute is proud to present Ibrahim Kalin, Chief Advisor to the Turkish Prime Minister, presenting his talk, Turkish Foreign Policy Between Ideology and Real Politics.
Good afternoon, and once again, thank you all for joining us. The last 2 weeks have been quite busy. We've had 3 events in 2 weeks, so it's good to see you twice a week, but I promise we'll slow down. Dr. Kalin is the Chief Advisor to the Turkish Prime Minister, and he's a faculty member at Georgetown University. And he's also the founding director of the SETA Foundation for Political, Economic and Social Research based in Ankara. And before he starts his presentation, I would like to give a very brief introduction, and then we will take the questions from the audience. As students of international relations, we were trained with the assumption that states are rational unitary actors, each moving towards their own national interests. And the realist school of thought has always prioritized national security and national interests rather than identities, ideologies, or ethics or social reconstructions. And yet, if you look at the literature on Turkish foreign policy, you will realize that Turkish foreign policy has always been analyzed, interpreted through the lens of an ideological debate between the East and between the country's Eastern and Western identities. So identity and ideology has always at the center of analysis in explaining Mustafa Kemal's disengagement from the Middle East, or Turgut Özal's re-engagement with the Middle East, or Turkey's Cold War alliance. So today, Dr. Kalin will address the issue, the question of identity and ideology in AKP's foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Gönül. Very happy to be here. I will try to present a short overview of where the Turkish foreign policy structure is moving, and leave specific policy issues to question and answers. I have, I believe, 15 minutes. Before I start, I want to congratulate also Dr. Gönül Tol for starting the Turkish program here in the Middle East Institute, which has in a very short period of time made its presence felt, I believe, with all the programs that they've been running, and I wish them best of success in the future. The reason I chose this title, Turkish Foreign Policy Between Ideology and Realpolitik, has something to do with the fact that, first of all, as Dr. Gönül pointed out, there is a debate about Turkish foreign policy and its ideological inclinations, but we tend to usually either neglect or pay less attention to the political economic necessities that force Turkey to take some of the foreign policy positions that Turkey has been taking over the last 10 years or so. There is, in fact, a good relationship of complementarity between the two. We tend to see, especially AK Parti's foreign policy, as driven by ideology, by neo-Ottomanism, by AK Parti's secret Islamism, or whatever you call them. But we tend to forget that, in fact, Turkey lives in an environment where it cannot remain indifferent to what's happening around its neighborhood. From energy issue to security, Turkey's own security problems, and its very, I think, sensitive geopolitical position. All of these factors force Turkey to be an active player in its region. But this is also made possible by the new developments that we see in the post-Cold War world. As globalization has become a reality of our lives, the world has become in some ways smaller, more interdependent, and we have to watch out for what's happening around ourselves. For Turkey to be a secure country with a growing economy, with a very dynamic population, Turkey has to play an active role in its environment. And this will bring us to the question of whether Turkey's main foreign policy axis is shifting from its traditional Western alliance to a more Middle Eastern or Islamic world orientation, and we will discuss some of these issues. But let me just try to outline for you the framework in which this new foreign policy outlook is taking shape. First of all, the end of the Cold War I think, imposed upon us a need for a new global order, and we all have seen the first test of this in the first Gulf War of 1991 and 1992. If you remember, the father Bush, president of the United States at that time, had said that, in fact, the reason why the United States was going into this war with Iraq was because there was a need, besides saving Kuwait from the occupation of Iraq, there was a need for a new global order. And that was the first major slogan after the end of the Cold War. That new global order never came about. In fact, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at the Balkans, if you look at the Caucasus, Russia, Central Asia, and the rest of the world, China, Africa, and other places, we've been struggling with a new kind of global order in economic terms, in political terms, in social terms, NGO terms, and in other fields. The first Gulf War did not lead to an order. Then came 9/11, and 9/11 upset what was already a very chaotic situation. And the United States, as the only remaining superpower in the world, was forced to act in a way that has created the history for the last 7-8 years, having an impact, obviously, for all of us around the world. The United States became a more kind of security-oriented superpower. Besides its interest in soft power elements, in establishing stability, etc., its own security concerns became #1 priority for U.S. foreign policy. In Europe, we see the rise of a kind of a more confused Europe about its own future, about its identity, how much the enlargement will go, the internal debates about the Lisbon Treaty, which was, as you know, had a good time last week. I believe at least it was a victory for those who endorsed the idea of the Lisbon Treaty, with the Irish finally ratifying the treaty. But as far as Turkey is concerned, to us, Europe still remains a confused power. Not sure about its own future, about its own multiculturalism within Europe, still struggling with the EU project. Issues of multiculturalism, as I said, EU as a global power, and other issues. Then you have the rise of a resurgent Russia. In a sense, the Russian Empire is gone, but the perception of Russia as a great power is still with us. And we have seen this very fast-forward history from the 1990s to the beginning of 2000, when Russia was dealing with internal economic, political issues. But now with Putin, Russia, whether this is objectively true or not, is in a position to say that I'm here to reassert my power. And I think we have seen an example of this in the Russian-Georgian war last year. Now, then, of course, the rest of the story, with China, India, Brazil, and other, growing or emerging economic powers. In a sense, what some Chinese analysts have called the system of one superpower, many great powers, is still up in the air. People are still trying to deal with the phenomenon of one superpower, several or many great powers around it, how that will create a world order. Now, in that context, Turkey is moving fast into the post-Cold War period, embracing globalization in a multitude of ways, and dealing with issues in its immediate environment. And Turkey is doing this with a new foreign policy outlook in terms of both substance and style. In recent years, especially the style of Turkish foreign policy has been kind of talked about. Proactive diplomacy, rhythmic diplomacy, zero problem with neighbors, etc. All of this kind of key elements of Turkish foreign policy. Some of them relate to style, the way Turkish foreign policy is run, the desire of the Turkish foreign policy makers to deal with the problems in its environment, not through confrontation, but through dialogue, engagement, and other elements of soft power. But in terms of substance also, I think we see an important change, an important shift in the way we look at some of the issues in our region. Now, in dealing with these issues, Turkey exercises power in a context which is determined by what I call two sets of issues, the variables and invariables of Turkish geopolitical position. What do I mean by the invariables? Turkey's history and geopolitical position are